They erased his name in court, but what his war dog uncovered in that mountain mansion destroyed everything. The judge finished reading the will, and just like that, Caleb Mercer no longer existed on paper. No land, no legacy, not even a sentence of gratitude. Hours later, standing before a silent stone mansion buried deep in the Colorado mountains, his wounded canine began clawing at the floor, revealing a secret powerful men had tried to bury for years. Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. The courtroom in Pine Ridge County was smaller than Caleb Mercer remembered. He hadn't been back in this mountain town since before his last deployment. The wooden benches were worn smooth from decades of ranchers and miners shifting under quiet verdicts. Fluorescent lights hummed above like tired insects. Outside the tall windows, the Colorado foothills were wrapped in late winter gray, ridgelines fading into mist. Caleb stood at the defense table in a pressed but aging jacket, shoulders squared out of habit more than confidence. His posture still carried the discipline of a Navy SEAL, even if his eyes told another story, one of sleepless nights and things he didn't talk about. Shadow sat at his left leg, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of the dog's body through the fabric of his trousers. The Belgian Malinois was alert but calm, amber eyes, scanning the room once before, settling forward again. Every few seconds, his tail brushed Caleb's boot, steady, grounding. The clerk cleared her throat. The last will and testament of Margaret Hale. Caleb inhaled slowly. Margaret Maggie had been the only family member who still called him by his childhood nickname, the only one who wrote letters when he was overseas, the only one who never asked him why he left. Across the aisle, Dylan Hale adjusted his tailored coat. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his expression composed and confident. Two men in expensive suits sat behind him, likely from his development firm. They leaned back comfortably, as if they already knew how this story ended. The judge began to read. All farmland holdings totaling 412 acres transferred to the Hale Mountain Development Trust. Caleb kept his face still. The lakefront parcel on Ironwood Reservoir transferred to the Hale Mountain Development Trust. Shadow shifted slightly. Caleb felt the subtle pressure of the dog's shoulder against his thigh. Investment accounts, securities, and mineral rights holdings transferred to Dylan Hale, sole executor. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Caleb didn't move. He'd learned long ago that movement wasted energy. He waited for his name. The judge turned a page. There was a pause. Too long. And this concludes the distribution of assets under the will. Caleb blinked once. That was it. No farmland. No lake cabin. No mention. Not even a sentimental keepsake. Not even a line of acknowledgement. The silence in the room deepened, heavy as snowfall. Dylan rose slowly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his sleeve. Your Honor, he said with polite calm, for clarity, there is no designated inheritance to Mr. Caleb Mercer. The judge looked down at the document again. That is correct. A few heads turned toward Caleb. The town had heard about him, about the blast injury overseas, about the early medical retirement, about the nights he'd been seen sitting in his truck near the edge of town, staring at the mountains like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Dylan sighed softly, just loud enough to carry. It's unfortunate, he said, his tone almost sympathetic. But Aunt Maggie was very particular about stability and continuity. The word hung in the air. Stability. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. The room blurred for half a second, fluorescent light flickering too bright. His pulse kicked faster than it should have. He focused on Shadow. Shadow immediately pressed closer, his flank firm against Caleb's leg, a quiet anchor. Dylan wasn't finished. With respect, he added smoothly, it would have been irresponsible to leave complex assets to someone still dealing with certain challenges. The word challenges dripped with implication. A cough somewhere in the back row. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Caleb could feel the heat rising in his chest. Not rage, not exactly. Something sharper, something quieter. The kind of wound that doesn't bleed in public. He thought of Maggie's handwritten letters. The way she'd underlined the word proud when she spoke about his service. The way she'd signed off every letter with, "Come home safe." Shadow nudged Caleb's hand, just once. Caleb looked down at him. The dog's ears were forward, eyes steady. No fear, no confusion, just presence. Caleb straightened fully. Understood, Your Honor, he said calmly. His voice didn't shake. The judge nodded. Mr. Mercer, if you have further questions, you may consult private counsel. Caleb gave a short nod. No, ma'am. Dylan stepped closer as the courtroom began to empty. He stopped just short of Caleb's space, careful, polished. "You know this wasn't personal," Dylan said quietly. "Maggie just wanted the land to stay productive, secure." Caleb met his cousin's eyes for the first time. "Secure from what?" Caleb asked evenly. Dylan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "From unpredictability." There it was again. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. The war had already taught him what unpredictability looked like. He turned and walked toward the exit. Shadow moved in perfect sync, shoulder brushing Caleb's leg with every step. The courthouse doors opened, and cold mountain air rushed in. Outside, the sky had turned darker. Snow threatened from the west, low clouds sliding over the peaks like silent artillery. Caleb descended the courthouse steps slowly. People avoided eye contact. A few offered small nods. One older rancher tipped his hat. No one said anything. Shadow stayed tight at Caleb's side until they reached the edge of the parking lot. There, beside a dented pickup truck that had seen too many winters, Caleb finally exhaled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of breath a man lets out when something inside him shifts. He leaned against the truck and closed his eyes for a moment. For a flicker of a second, the courthouse stairs became concrete steps in a foreign village. The cold air smelled like dust and smoke. The murmur of townspeople turned into distant radio chatter. His hands twitched instinctively. Shadow rose onto his hind legs and placed his front paws gently against Caleb's chest. Grounding. Caleb opened his eyes. The courthouse returned. The mountains. The parking lot. He placed his forehead briefly against Shadow's. "I'm good," he whispered. Shadow didn't move away until Caleb's breathing slowed. Across the lot, Dylan climbed into a black SUV. He glanced once at Caleb through tinted glass. Then the vehicle pulled away. Snow began to fall in thin, hesitant flakes. Caleb opened the passenger door of his truck, and Shadow jumped inside, circling once before settling into the seat. Caleb remained standing outside for a moment longer, looking back at the courthouse. Disowned in court. Erased on paper. He slid into the driver's seat and shut the door. The engine coughed twice before turning over. Inside the cab, the silence felt different than the one in the courtroom. Less humiliating. More honest. Caleb rested one hand on the steering wheel, and the other on Shadow's neck. "They can keep the land," he said quietly. Shadow's ears flicked. Caleb looked out at the mountains rising beyond town, but somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the humiliation and the exhaustion, something unsettled remained. Maggie had written to him just 3 weeks before she died, and in that letter, she had said one thing clearly: "Don't let them tell you who you are." Caleb shifted the truck into gear. He didn't know yet that this wasn't the end of Maggie's story, and he didn't know that the real inheritance hadn't been spoken in that courtroom at all. Snow thickened as he drove out of town, tires crunching softly over the road. Shadow rested his chin on Caleb's thigh, and behind them, in a courtroom that already felt smaller than before, the will had been read, but something had been left unsaid. Caleb drove only as far as the edge of town before pulling into the gravel lot beside Miller's Hardware. The snow had begun to fall harder now, thin white streaks drifting sideways in the wind. The mountains to the west were fading into a solid wall of gray. He shut off the engine and sat there. Shadow remained quiet, his breathing steady, eyes alert but relaxed. Caleb rested his forehead against the steering wheel for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around him. The humiliation of the courtroom still echoed in his chest, not explosive, not loud, just heavy, a dull bruise. He had known Maggie's estate would be complicated. Dylan had been circling the land for years, pushing development proposals, talking about modernizing the foothills. But to be erased completely, that stung, in a way bullets never had. Shadow shifted slightly and placed his paw on Caleb's thigh. "I'm okay," Caleb murmured, but even as he said it, his mind betrayed him. The snow tapping against the windshield became the distant crack of rifle fire. The hardware store sign flickered like a flare. His heartbeat climbed faster than it should have. The edges of his vision tightened. Shadow leaned his full weight into Caleb's side. The pressure grounded him. Caleb blinked hard, forcing himself to name what he saw. Snow, truck, parking lot, Colorado. Not overseas, not a convoy, not that road. His breathing steadied. A knock sounded lightly on the passenger side window. Caleb's head snapped up, instincts firing before logic. His hand moved reflexively toward a weapon that wasn't there. Shadow's ears lifted, but he did not growl. A woman stood outside, bundled in a navy wool coat, auburn hair pinned back against the wind. She held a leather briefcase under one arm and looked faintly out of breath. Caleb lowered the window halfway. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "That's me. I'm Olivia Brooks. I was in the courtroom." Caleb studied her face carefully. Early 40s, sharp eyes, no smugness, no pity. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "I'd prefer to talk somewhere out of the wind," she said gently. Caleb hesitated. Shadow watched her closely, nostrils flaring once. After a moment, Caleb unlocked the passenger door. Olivia climbed in, brushing snow from her coat. The truck smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old leather. She shut the door and let out a breath. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "I know today was difficult." Caleb gave a short nod. "That's one word." Olivia opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick envelope. It was cream-colored, sealed with a simple strip of tape. No official court stamp, no letterhead. "This wasn't part of the probate reading," she said. Caleb's eyes sharpened. "What is it?" "Your aunt filed a secondary deed 2 years ago," Olivia replied. "It was registered under an agricultural trust code, legal, but obscure. It wouldn't automatically appear during standard probate unless someone specifically searched for it." Caleb frowned. "Why wouldn't it be included?" "Because it's not listed as an estate asset under her primary holdings," Olivia said. "It's a separate parcel, completely isolated." Isolated. She handed him the envelope. Shadow leaned forward, nose brushing lightly against the paper, before Caleb even touched it. Caleb noticed. He broke the seal carefully. Inside was a folded document and a handwritten note. The document was a property deed. Coordinates listed in the Rocky Mountain foothills, north of Ironwood Reservoir. No address, just latitude and longitude. 308 acres. Caleb's pulse shifted, not racing, but alert. "Margaret Hale," he read softly. "Transfers full ownership of parcel 17B to Caleb Mercer." He looked up. "She left me land?" Olivia nodded slowly. "An estate structure. Old stone construction. It's been off the county grid for years. Minimal records. No current utilities registered." Caleb swallowed. Why wasn't it mentioned in court? Olivia met his eyes. Because no one asked the right question. The wind rocked the truck slightly. Caleb unfolded the handwritten note. Her script was unmistakable, steady, deliberate. "Caleb, if they choose profit over memory, let them. The real foundation was never meant for them. Trust the one who sees what others ignore." "Maggie." Caleb read it twice. "Trust the one who sees what others ignore." He glanced down at Shadow. The dog's eyes were fixed on him, steady as ever. "What is this place?" Caleb asked quietly. Olivia hesitated. "I visited it once, about 6 months before she passed," she admitted. "She asked me to update some documentation." "And?" "It didn't feel abandoned," Olivia said carefully. "It felt guarded." A chill slid down Caleb's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Guarded how?" "She seemed nervous," Olivia continued. "Like she believed someone might try to force her hand before she was ready." "Dylan," Caleb said flatly. "I can't prove that," Olivia replied. "But your aunt knew he was pushing aggressively to consolidate her holdings. That foothill region is strategic. Developers want it for high-end cabins." Caleb folded the deed slowly. "So she hid it." "She protected it," Olivia corrected gently. Silence settled between them. Outside, snow gathered along the edges of the windshield. Caleb leaned back in his seat, staring at the coordinates printed on the paper. Something stirred beneath the humiliation, something steadier. "Purpose. Is it legally mine?" he asked. "Yes," Olivia said. "The paperwork is airtight. It's recorded, filed, witnessed." "Then why tell me now?" Olivia's expression softened. "Because your aunt asked me to deliver it after the will reading. Specifically after." Caleb felt the weight of that. She had known. She had anticipated the erasure. Shadow rested his chin against Caleb's arm. "Does Dylan know about it?" Caleb asked. Olivia shook her head. "Not unless he went digging in obscure county records. And trust me, most people don't." Caleb stared out at the mountains again. An isolated estate. 300 acres. Hidden under obscure codes. "What's on it?" he asked. Olivia's eyes shifted slightly. "A stone mansion, built in the 1920s. Remote, surrounded by pine forest." Caleb exhaled slowly. "You've seen it?" "Yes. And?" It doesn't look like something meant to be sold, she said. Snow hit the windshield harder now. Caleb folded the documents carefully and slid them back into the envelope. He looked at Shadow. What do you think? He asked quietly. Shadow's ears lifted. His tail gave a single, deliberate thump against the seat. Caleb almost smiled. He turned back to Olivia. How far? About 40 miles north, she replied. Up a mountain pass. The road's narrow this time of year. Caleb nodded. He had driven worse. Olivia reached for the door handle, then paused. Caleb, she said softly, your aunt believed you were stronger than they think. He met her gaze. She didn't see instability, Olivia added. She saw resilience. The word landed differently than Dylan's had. Resilience. Olivia stepped out into the snow and shut the door. Caleb watched her cross the parking lot and disappear into the hardware store. Inside the truck, it was just him and Shadow again. The envelope rested in Caleb's lap like something fragile and explosive at the same time. Trust the one who sees what others ignore. Caleb reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ear. Looks like we're not done yet, he said quietly. Shadow lifted his head, alert. Caleb started the engine. The truck rolled slowly back onto the main road, tires crunching over fresh snow. The mountains ahead were darker now, almost black against the sky. Isolation waited up there. So did whatever Maggie had protected. And for the first time since the courtroom, the humiliation inside Caleb began to shift. Not into anger. Not yet. But into something steadier. Something that felt like a mission. Caleb hadn't felt that in a long time. Not since the day he turned in his trident and walked off base with a medical discharge stamped across his future. The road north climbed quickly, cutting through pine forest that thickened with every mile. Snow gathered along the shoulders, drifting in soft waves against old wooden fence posts. The sky pressed low over the Rockies, heavy and colorless. Inside the truck, the heater hummed softly. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, eyes scanning the road ahead. He didn't sleep. Not when Caleb drove through terrain like this. The coordinates Olivia had given him were pinned on the dashboard. Caleb checked them once more before the cell signal disappeared. 40 miles, he murmured. Piece of cake, but the mountain pass ahead narrowed, the asphalt thinning into a winding ribbon that disappeared into white. As the truck climbed higher, the world outside shifted. Snow thickened. Wind picked up. The trees grew taller and closer, their branches sagging under the weight of ice. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Caleb's breathing changed. The snow hitting the windshield began to look different. Not snow. Sand. Fine, blinding sand. The engine's steady rumble deepened in his ears, transforming into the distant vibration of armored vehicles. The road ahead flattened in his mind, becoming something else, something overseas, something unforgiving. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Shadow noticed first. The dog shifted closer, placing his paw firmly against Caleb's thigh. Grounding. Caleb blinked once. The road returned. Pine trees. Snow. Colorado. Not desert. Not heat. Not that day. He forced himself to speak out loud. Blue Ridge Pass, he said quietly. 41 degrees north. Shadow's ears flicked. Caleb focused on the details. The shape of the rearview mirror. The crack in the dashboard. The faint smell of motor oil. Snow. Truck. Shadow. He exhaled slowly. I'm here, he said under his breath. Shadow leaned into him, solid and real. The episode passed. They continued upward. By late afternoon, the road narrowed further, eventually turning into a gravel track, barely visible under fresh snowfall. Caleb shifted into four-wheel drive. No tire marks. No recent traffic. The forest swallowed sound. The world felt suspended. As they rounded the final bend, the trees parted just enough to reveal something ahead. Stone. Tall. Dark. Caleb slowed the truck. The estate emerged gradually from the white. A mansion of gray stone, 3 stories tall, its steep rooflines edged with snow. Tall windows, dark and unlit, stared out over the valley. A wraparound porch circled the front, its wooden rails weathered but intact. It didn't look abandoned. It looked patient. Shadow stood up in the seat, nose pressed toward the windshield. You see it? Caleb murmured. The truck rolled forward slowly, tires crunching through untouched snow until they reached the circular drive. Caleb cut the engine. Silence. The kind of silence that pressed inward. No birds. No distant highway. No hum of power lines. Just wind sliding through pine needles. Caleb stepped out into knee-deep snow. The cold hit hard, and clean. Shadow jumped down beside him, landing lightly, immediately scanning the perimeter. Caleb turned in a slow circle. 300 acres. Forest. Rocky slope rising behind the mansion. A narrow trail leading down toward what looked like a frozen creek. He studied the front steps. No footprints. No tire tracks beyond his own. But as he moved around the side of the house, Shadow stopped abruptly. The dog's body stiffened. Caleb followed his gaze. Near the back entrance, partially covered by fresh snowfall, was a faint depression in the white. A footprint, not sharp, not fresh, but recent enough to disturb the smooth surface. Caleb crouched carefully. The print was large, boot tread, not his. His pulse slowed not with fear, but with focus. "Someone's been here," he murmured. Shadow's tail remained still. Caleb scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of pine and old stone. He stood slowly. "Could be hunters," he said quietly. "Could be nothing." But he didn't believe that. He returned to the front door. The brass handle was cold beneath his glove. The wood was solid oak, reinforced with iron hinges. Caleb inserted the key attached to the deed envelope. It turned easily. No resistance. The door opened inward with a long, low creak. Cold air breathed out from inside. Shadow entered first, stepping across the threshold with controlled caution. Caleb followed. The entry hall was vast. Marble floor beneath a thin layer of dust. A grand staircase sweeping upward along the right wall. Chandeliers hanging overhead, crystal dim under years of neglect. Furniture covered in white sheets, like figures waiting to be revealed. Caleb shut the door behind them. The wind outside faded. The silence inside felt different, thicker. Shadow moved ahead slowly, nose low, ears alert. Caleb's boots echoed softly against the marble. He lifted his flashlight and swept it across the walls. Photographs. Old black and white frames. Maggie standing beside men in military uniforms. Younger. Stronger. Smiling in a way Caleb had never seen. He paused at one image. Maggie stood beside a group of soldiers in desert fatigues, her hand resting on the shoulder of a service dog. Caleb frowned. He hadn't known about that. Shadow let out a low, quiet sound, not a growl, not a bark. Something between curiosity and warning. Caleb turned. Shadow stood in the center of the hallway, staring down at the floor. The dog began pacing in a tight circle. Then he stopped and scratched once at a section of warped hardwood near the base of the staircase. Caleb walked over. The wood looked slightly different, newer screws, subtle discoloration. He knelt. "Easy," he whispered. Shadow stepped back but remained focused. Caleb pressed his fingers along the seam. There. A faint gap. He gripped the edge and pulled. The board lifted with surprising ease. Beneath it, steel. A reinforced hatch. Industrial. Modern. Not original to a 1920s mansion. Caleb's heart slowed to a deliberate beat. "Okay," he said quietly. Shadow stepped closer, sniffing the edges. Before Caleb could reach for the handle, a sudden burst of white light flashed across the front windows. Headlights. Both men and dog froze. Shadow's ears snapped forward. The sound of tires crunching through snow approached the front drive. Caleb rose slowly, every muscle alert. He moved toward the window and carefully parted the curtain just enough to see. A black SUV rolled into view, followed by another. The engines idled, exhaust rising in thick plumes. Caleb's jaw tightened. Shadow let out a low, controlled growl. The vehicles stopped directly in front of the mansion. Caleb watched as the driver's side door opened. Dylan Hale stepped out into the snow. Behind him, two men in heavy jackets emerged, scanning the property. The emotional shift hit Caleb immediately. The mission had just become contested. Snow continued to fall in slow, steady silence, and the steel hatch beneath the floor waited, unopened. Shadow stood beside Caleb, perfectly still. Whatever Maggie had hidden here, they weren't the only ones who knew. The engines outside continued to idle, low and steady, vibrating faintly through the stone walls. Headlights washed across the tall front windows in pale beams that cut through drifting dust. Caleb stepped away from the curtain slowly. Shadow remained still but coiled, muscles taut beneath his coat. His growl was not loud. It was controlled, contained warning, not panic. "Easy," Caleb murmured under his breath. The steel hatch beneath the floorboard seemed heavier now, more significant. Whatever lay below it was important enough to draw Dylan up a snow-covered mountain before nightfall. Boots crunched across the front porch. A sharp knock echoed through the entry hall. Caleb didn't move. Another knock, harder, Caleb, Dylan's voice called through the door, polite but edged. We know you're inside. Shadow shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of Caleb. Caleb walked calmly toward the front door. He paused, then opened it halfway. Cold air rushed in. Dylan stood on the porch in a dark overcoat, snow clinging to his shoulders. The two men behind him were broader, less polished contractor types, heavy boots, hard expressions. Dylan smiled thinly. Didn't expect you to move in so fast, he said. I didn't know I needed your permission, Caleb replied evenly. Dylan glanced past him into the foyer, eyes scanning. This property was scheduled for review, Dylan said. Structural evaluation, environmental clearance. It's not safe. Caleb leaned casually against the doorframe. Seemed solid enough. One of the contractors stepped forward slightly, boots grinding into the snow. Roads bad, he muttered. Storm coming in heavy tonight. Caleb met Dylan's eyes. You didn't drive 40 miles in a snowstorm to give me a weather report. Dylan's smile faded. He lowered his voice. Let's not make this complicated. That estate is tied into larger plans, development contracts, investors. You showing up here. That creates confusion. Caleb remained still. I have a deed, he said. An obscure agricultural filing, Dylan replied. Maggie was sentimental. She liked games. Shadow stepped forward 1 inch. The contractor noticed and instinctively stiffened. Dylan held up a calming hand. Relax, I'm not here for drama. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Sign a temporary transfer, he said. We'll compensate you. Generously. Enough to get you stable. Comfortable. There it was again. Stable. Shadow's ears twitched. Caleb didn't take the paper. And if I don't? He asked quietly. Dylan's jaw tightened. Then things get messy. Legal disputes, structural condemnations, liability issues. His gaze dropped briefly to Shadow. Questions about suitability. The word hung heavier than before. Caleb felt the old heat rising, but he controlled it. I'm not signing anything, he said. Snow swirled sideways between them. Dylan studied him carefully. You don't know what's buried here, Dylan said, his voice lowering further. And trust me, you don't want to. Caleb held his stare. Funny, he replied. That's exactly what I intend to find out. Silence stretched across the porch. For a moment, something flickered in Dylan's expression, not arrogance, not confidence. Concern. He masked it quickly. You've always had a stubborn streak, Dylan said lightly. Be careful it doesn't cost you. Caleb didn't respond. After a tense pause, Dylan stepped back. We'll talk again, he said. The contractors returned to the SUVs. Engines revved slightly. As Dylan turned to leave, he paused once more and glanced at the front window. Storm's worse up here, he added. Road might close. Then he climbed into the passenger seat. The SUVs backed down the circular drive, tires cutting fresh tracks into the snow. Caleb remained on the porch until the red taillights disappeared into the trees. Only then did he close the door. Inside, the house felt colder. Not physically. Aware. Shadow moved immediately back toward the warped floorboard near the staircase. He sniffed it again, then looked up at Caleb. Caleb knelt. They know something, he said quietly. Shadow's tail remained rigid. Caleb pulled the board aside fully this time. The steel hatch gleamed beneath a thin layer of dust, industrial hinges, a recessed handle. This was no antique cellar door. This was installed deliberately. Caleb ran his gloved hand across the metal. Cold, solid, hidden. He lifted the handle and tested it. Locked. Not with a padlock, but with an internal mechanism. He scanned the edges. A keypad sat flush along one side, nearly invisible against the steel. Caleb exhaled softly. Maggie hadn't just hidden something. She'd secured it. Shadow stepped back slightly, then tilted his head toward the front of the house. Caleb froze. Through the stone walls, faint but distinct, came the sound of gravel crunching again. He moved to the window carefully. Not Dylan. Another vehicle. A pickup truck. It stopped briefly at the end of the drive. The engine idled for several seconds, then it shut off. Caleb's pulse slowed into that familiar operational rhythm. Assess. Position. Wait. Shadow stood beside him, silent. The truck door opened. A lone figure stepped out. Broad-shouldered. Hat pulled low. The man walked only halfway up the drive before stopping. He looked toward the mansion. Then, after a moment, he turned back, climbed into the truck, and drove away without approaching the house. Caleb watched until the vehicle vanished behind trees. Shadow's body relaxed slightly. "That's two," Caleb murmured. Two parties interested in the same isolated mountain estate. He returned to the hatch. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Wind slid around the corners of the mansion. The house felt like it was listening. Caleb removed his gloves and pressed his palm flat against the cold steel. "If Maggie wanted this found," he said quietly, "she wanted it found now." Shadow's ears lifted. Caleb stood and scanned the foyer once more. No cameras visible, no alarms, no sound but wind. He grabbed a small multi-tool from his pack and examined the keypad closely. 4 digits. Simple. Maggie had never been flashy. She'd been deliberate. Caleb's eyes drifted briefly to the framed photograph of her beside the soldiers. Desert uniforms. Service dogs. He stepped toward it and lifted it from the wall. On the back, faint pencil markings. 4, 1, 7, 2. Caleb stared at the numbers. He returned to the hatch and entered the code. For a moment nothing happened. Then, a muted click. The internal lock disengaged. Shadow's ears snapped forward. Caleb grasped the handle and pulled. The hatch opened slowly, revealing a dark stairwell, descending into shadow. Cold air rose from below, carrying the faint scent of concrete and metal. Not earth, not storage. Structured, deliberate. Caleb flicked on his flashlight and shined it downward. Steel steps, reinforced walls, electrical conduit along the ceiling. This wasn't a root cellar. It was a bunker. He looked at Shadow. "You ready?" Shadow stepped toward the opening without hesitation. Caleb descended carefully, each step echoing faintly. The hatch above remained open, a rectangle of pale light shrinking as they moved deeper. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets. Locked cabinets, metal shelves, sealed crates stamped with dates and coded markings. Caleb swept the beam slowly across the room. The air was dry, preserved. Maggie hadn't hidden valuables. She'd archived something. Shadow moved down the hallway and stopped at a section of wall. He sniffed once, then pawed gently at the paneling. Caleb approached. The panel shifted under pressure. Behind it, a concealed safe, larger than the hatch above. Caleb felt his breath slow. Whatever this was, it wasn't about inheritance. It was about protection. He turned the handle, and as the safe door creaked open, Caleb realized something else. The emotional shift was complete. This wasn't humiliation anymore. It wasn't uncertainty. It was escalation. And the mountain had just revealed its first secret. The safe door opened with a slow, metallic groan. Inside were not stacks of cash or antique jewelry. Instead, Caleb saw neatly labeled binders, sealed manila envelopes, and 3 ruggedized hard drives secured in foam casing. Each binder was marked with dates stretching back nearly 15 years. Shadow stood close, nose working the air, but he did not bark. His instincts were alert, not alarmed. Caleb reached in and lifted the top binder. Hale Mountain Development. Acquisition Records. His jaw tightened. He opened to the first tab. Property Transfer Agreements. Survey Maps. Signatures. Some clean. Some not. He flipped to another section. Land Valuation Discrepancies. Pressure letters sent to elderly landowners. Contract clauses hidden in fine print. Caleb's pulse slowed into that same operational calm he had felt in darker places overseas, the kind of focus that narrowed the world into what mattered. "This isn't sentimental," he murmured. Shadow's ears flicked. "This is evidence." He set the binder aside and lifted one of the sealed envelopes. Inside were photocopies of bank transactions tied to shell companies, names that circled back to Dylan's firm. Maggie hadn't been hiding money. She had been documenting something. Snow struck the hatch opening above with growing intensity. The storm was thickening. Caleb grabbed the 3 hard drives and slid them into his pack. He wasn't naive enough to think Dylan's visit had been coincidence. Dylan knew something was here. Maybe not everything, but enough. A sharp, distant rumble of thunder rolled through the mountains. Shadow's head lifted. Then, the sound of engines again. Caleb stiffened. Headlights flashed faintly across the stairwell opening. "They're back," Caleb said quietly. Shadow moved toward the stairs immediately. Caleb shut the safe, secured the panel back into place, and climbed quickly. The wind had grown louder, rattling the old windows. By the time he reached the foyer, heavy snow was whipping sideways across the porch. 2 SUVs again. Dylan stepped out first, coat pulled tight against the storm. The contractors followed. They didn't knock this time. Dylan tried the door handle. Locked. He knocked sharply. "Caleb," he called through the wood. "We need to resolve this before the county shuts the road down." Caleb opened the door only a few inches. Snow blew in around Dylan's shoulders. "You just left," Caleb said. "I reconsidered," Dylan replied. "This doesn't have to become adversarial." Shadow stood between Caleb and the threshold, silent and unmoving. Dylan's eyes flicked downward briefly. "You're in over your head," he continued. "That property is tied into development contracts worth millions. There are investors, timelines. If this drags into litigation, you'll be crushed financially." Caleb leaned slightly against the doorframe, controlled. "Funny," he said. "I thought it was just an unsafe building." Dylan's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. The wind howled louder. "I'll make this simple," Dylan said. "Sign over temporary control. You walk away with enough to start fresh. A house in town. Stability." The word hung again. Stable, comfortable, small. Caleb felt something steady inside him now, not anger, but clarity. "You're afraid of something," Caleb said quietly. Dylan's expression hardened. "I'm protecting what's been built." "No," Caleb replied. "You're protecting what's been hidden." The contractors shifted uncomfortably in the storm. Snow clung to Shadow's fur along the threshold, but the dog did not move. Dylan lowered his voice. "You don't understand the scale of this. There are documents, agreements, obligations. You dig around in things you don't comprehend, you'll create consequences." End quote. Caleb held his gaze. "I comprehend intimidation," he said evenly. A flash of lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the entire mountainside in harsh white light. For 1 second, Dylan's polished composure slipped. "You always were stubborn," Dylan muttered. "And you always underestimated me," Caleb replied. The wind pushed harder, forcing the contractors to brace themselves. Dylan reached into his coat again and pulled out a checkbook this time. He wrote quickly, tore the check free, and held it up. A number large enough to change most lives. "Last offer," Dylan said. Caleb didn't look at the amount. He looked at the man holding it. "My aunt didn't leave this place to you," Caleb said calmly. "And she didn't leave it empty." Dylan's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Caleb stepped forward slightly, forcing Dylan back a half step against the snow. "It means you're not the only one who knew there was more." The storm roared between them. Dylan's breathing shifted, controlled, but tighter. "You have no idea what you're stepping into," he said quietly. Caleb's voice stayed level. "Then you shouldn't have stepped on this mountain tonight." For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Then Dylan slowly lowered the check. "Fine," he said. "We'll do this formally." He turned and walked toward the SUVs. Before getting in, he glanced back once more. "You don't know what's buried here," he repeated. The engine started. This time, they reversed down the drive without hesitation, tires sliding slightly on the snow-covered gravel. Caleb shut the door firmly. Inside, the house felt colder, but not fragile. Shadow shook snow from his coat and walked to Caleb's side. The emotional shift settled fully now. Fear had passed. In its place was controlled anger. Not explosive. Focused. Caleb moved to the front window and watched until the red taillights disappeared again. The storm thickened, swallowing the road behind them. They were alone now. Truly alone. He walked back toward the staircase and looked down at the floorboard covering the hatch. Whatever Maggie had built below this house was bigger than land disputes. Dylan wasn't worried about square footage. He was worried about exposure. Caleb rested a hand on Shadow's head. "We're not selling," he said quietly. Shadow's tail thumped once. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the entire entry hall in stark contrast dust motes hanging in the air like suspended memories. The mountain had issued its warning. But Caleb had already chosen. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about truth. And truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deep it was buried. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the steel hatch waited beneath the floor. And for the first time since the courtroom, Caleb felt something steady anchor his chest. Not humiliation, not uncertainty. Resolve. The storm pressed hard against the stone walls, wind howling through the pines like something restless and ancient. Snow struck the windows in steady bursts, but inside the mansion, the air had changed. Caleb stood over the warped floorboard, flashlight in one hand, Shadow steady at his side. "Time to see what she was protecting," Caleb said quietly. He pulled the board aside and descended once more into the bunker. The stairwell felt colder than before, as if the storm above had driven the temperature downward. The overhead bulb flickered faintly, but held steady. The reinforced hallway stretched ahead, lined with metal cabinets, labeled in Maggie's careful handwriting. Caleb moved methodically. Shadow stayed one step ahead, scanning corners, checking shadows, pausing at intervals as if listening for something deeper than sound. Caleb opened the first cabinet. Inside were neatly organized files, each clipped and cross-referenced. Ironwood Reservoir zoning amendments, Pinecrest Valley disputed survey boundaries, senior property transfers conditional signatures. He flipped through pages slowly. There were letters from elderly landowners who had been pressured into selling, emails printed and annotated, legal memos outlining loopholes used to shift mineral rights without clear disclosure. Caleb felt his pulse steady further. This wasn't speculation, it was documentation. He opened another drawer. Bank transfers linked to shell companies, wire receipts routed through out-of-state accounts, land parcels consolidated under corporate trusts with Dylan's name buried deep in the hierarchy. Maggie hadn't been sentimental. She had been strategic. Shadow moved toward the far end of the hallway again and paused at the concealed safe behind the wall panel. Caleb followed and reopened it fully this time. Inside, beneath the binders, sat a small digital recorder and a sealed envelope marked in Maggie's handwriting. For Caleb only. He froze for a moment. The bunker felt tighter suddenly, more personal. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Caleb, if you are reading this, then I did not misjudge you. There are things I uncovered that reach farther than land deals. Men who believe power justifies anything. I could not fight them publicly, but I could record them. Trust Shadow. He sees what others do not. Love, Maggie. Caleb swallowed. He inserted the USB into a small laptop he carried in his pack. The screen flickered to life. Video files populated the display. Timestamped. Dated. He clicked the first one. The screen filled with an image of Maggie sitting at a wooden desk older than the photographs upstairs, but sharp-eyed and deliberate. If you're watching this, Caleb, she began, then you're standing somewhere beneath my house. Her voice echoed faintly in the bunker. I didn't want you pulled into this, but I also knew you wouldn't walk away from the truth. The video cut to grainy surveillance footage Dylan meeting with investors in what looked like a private lodge near the reservoir. Contracts slid across tables. Voices lowered. Phrases like fast-track acquisition and quiet compliance. Caleb's jaw tightened. Another video showed Dylan's firm representatives speaking to an elderly rancher, applying subtle pressure about zoning penalties and tax reassessments. It wasn't violence. It was calculated leverage. Legal, on the surface. Manipulative beneath. Shadow shifted beside Caleb, ears forward. Caleb paused the video and leaned back against the cold concrete wall. The emotional shift hit him fully. Shock. Not at corruption he'd seen worse in war zones, but at Maggie. She had known. She had gathered this quietly, methodically for years. She was building a case, Caleb murmured. Shadow's tail moved once. Caleb opened another folder. Blueprints. Architectural renderings of luxury cabin developments stretching across what used to be independent family land. Red lines marking forced acquisitions. Ironwood Valley Master Expansion Plan. Caleb stared at the date. 2 months before Maggie's death, the pieces aligned. Dylan hadn't just inherited land. He had been positioning for something massive, and Maggie had stood in the way. Thunder cracked loudly overhead, shaking faint dust from the ceiling. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't about inheritance. It was about obstruction. Maggie had obstructed, and now Caleb owned the one parcel that connected everything. The estate sat at the center of the projected expansion map, a keystone property. Without it, the development fractured. Shadow suddenly moved down the hallway again, nose low. He stopped at a metal cabinet Caleb hadn't opened yet. The dog pawed at it twice. Caleb approached. The cabinet was locked. He examined the lock briefly, then used the multi-tool to pry gently at the edge. It gave way with a metallic snap. Inside were 3 sealed crates, stamped with dates and a simple code. MH Archive 7. He opened the first crate. More hard drives. Backup copies. Printed affidavits signed by local residents. He opened the second. Photographs of survey markers relocated without consent. Original land deeds with alterations highlighted in red. The third crate stopped him. Inside was a small file marked Federal Contact Draft, not submitted. Caleb opened it slowly. Maggie had prepared a formal report outlining fraudulent development practices tied to Dylan's firm and associated investors. Names were listed. Influential names. State-level contacts. Out-of-county investors. One federal liaison who had not responded. Caleb exhaled slowly. She was going to blow this open, he whispered. Shadow looked up at him, and she didn't get the chance. Lightning flashed again above, followed by rolling thunder. The storm felt different now, not threatening. Clearing. Caleb gathered the most critical binders and sealed the rest back into the crates. He secured 2 hard drives in separate compartments of his pack. Redundancy. Always. As he turned to leave, he paused. The bunker felt less like a hiding place and more like a vault. Maggie hadn't been hoarding. She had been safeguarding. Caleb climbed the stairs slowly, Shadow following close behind. At the top, he pulled the hatch closed and replaced the floorboard carefully. The foyer returned to stillness. The storm had begun to ease. Wind softened. Snow fell more gently. Caleb walked to the front window and looked out over the white landscape. The mountains stretched wide and silent beneath the fading storm clouds. Somewhere below, in town, Dylan believed he was still in control. Caleb rested his hand on Shadow's head. "They thought you were unstable," he said, quietly. Shadow's ears twitched. Caleb looked back at the staircase, at the hidden hatch beneath it. They don't know what steady looks like. The emotional shift was complete. Anger had cooled into something sharper, determination backed by evidence. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't rumor. It was proof, and now it belonged to him. Outside, the clouds began to thin. The first faint break of pale evening light touched the snow-covered pines. The bunker beneath the mansion held years of hidden truth, and Caleb understood something clearly now. Dylan hadn't come tonight to intimidate him. He had come to see if the secret was still buried. It wasn't, and the mountain had just given Caleb more than land. It had given him leverage. By dawn, the storm had passed. The foothills glittered under a thin wash of pale sunlight, snow resting clean and undisturbed across the valley. The mansion stood quiet behind him as Caleb loaded his truck. 2 hard drives were secured in separate compartments. Printed copies of the most critical documents rested inside a waterproof case beneath the seat. Redundancy. Always. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat and settled, though his posture remained alert. He had not slept much. Neither had Caleb. The night had been long not because of fear, but because of clarity. He had reviewed enough evidence to understand the scale of what Maggie had uncovered. Land transfers, pressure tactics, silent intimidation. Investors who would not appreciate exposure. He needed to get the material somewhere safe. Somewhere off the mountain. He started the engine and steered down the winding gravel road, tires cutting through fresh snow. The descent felt steeper in daylight. Halfway down the pass, Caleb noticed something. Tracks. Fresh ones, not from last night's storm. SUV tires. He slowed. Shadow lifted his head. The tracks led ahead toward town. Caleb continued carefully. The old mining town of Pine Ridge came into view by mid-morning, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, church steeple cutting into the bright sky. He didn't go straight to Olivia's office. Instead, he parked near the old rail line by the edge of town. The abandoned grain warehouse stood there, weathered wood siding, rusted metal roof, faded lettering barely visible above sliding doors. Caleb stepped out into the cold air. Shadow followed, scanning the area. This had once been a shipping hub for wheat and mining equipment. Now, it was mostly empty, occasionally used for equipment storage by contractors. Caleb needed a quiet place to duplicate the hard drives before handing anything over. He entered through a side door he remembered from years ago. The interior was dim, shafts of sunlight slipping through broken boards high above. Dust hung in the air like fine mist. He set his pack down on a wooden crate and pulled out one of the drives. Shadow paced the perimeter slowly. Caleb connected the drive to his laptop. Files began transferring onto a backup unit. He worked methodically, eyes flicking occasionally toward the entrance. Then, the sound of tires on gravel outside. Shadow froze. Caleb's hand stopped on the keyboard. The engine shut off. A door opened. Bootsteps. Shadow moved closer to Caleb, body angled protectively. Caleb stood slowly. The side door creaked open. Dylan stepped inside, followed by one of the contractors from the night before. The contractor's face was hard, jaw set tight. Dylan removed his gloves calmly. "You're predictable," he said, glancing at the laptop. "I knew you wouldn't sit on that mountain." Caleb closed the laptop halfway. "You're following me now?" he asked evenly. "I'm protecting my interests," Dylan replied. Shadow shifted slightly in front of Caleb. Dylan's eyes flicked toward the dog again. "Let's skip the dramatics," Dylan said. "Whatever you found, hand it over." Caleb's expression did not change. I don't know what you're talking about. The contractor took a step forward. You went into that house, he said bluntly. You don't belong there. Caleb's gaze sharpened. I have a deed, he replied. Dylan's composure began to thin. You don't understand the scale of what's involved, he said. You think this is a family dispute? It's not. You expose those files. You don't just hurt me. Who else? Caleb asked. Dylan hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was enough. Shadow sensed the tension shift. His body stiffened, ears forward, eyes locked on the contractor. Caleb's voice lowered. You're not worried about land, he said. You're worried about the names in those files. The contractor moved his hand inside his jacket. It wasn't a dramatic motion. It was subtle. But Shadow reacted instantly. He lunged not in attack, but in positioning, placing himself squarely between Caleb and the contractor. The contractor pulled out a firearm, holding it low but visible. The air inside the warehouse tightened like a wire. Don't, Caleb said sharply. Shadow did not bark. He stood firm, shoulders squared, eyes fixed. Put it away, Dylan snapped at the contractor, his voice cracking slightly. This isn't necessary. But the contractor's hand trembled. In that split second of instability, everything fractured. The contractor stumbled slightly on loose gravel. The firearm discharged accidentally. The sound exploded through the warehouse. Shadow cried out and dropped to one knee, shoulder jolting backward. Caleb's world slowed. He didn't shout. He didn't charge. He moved with controlled precision. He grabbed Shadow immediately, pulling him back behind a wooden crate for cover. Stay down, Caleb commanded. Dylan's face had drained of color. What did you do? He shouted at the contractor. It was an accident, the man stammered. Shadow lay against Caleb's leg, breathing fast but conscious. Blood seeped through fur along his shoulder, bright against the tan coat. Caleb pressed his hand firmly over the wound. It's okay, he murmured. You're okay. The contractor lowered the firearm shakily. Dylan looked horrified, not from guilt, but from consequence. Sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. Someone in town had heard the shot. Dylan stepped back. This isn't what I wanted, he said, voice tight. Caleb looked up at him slowly. You crossed a line, Caleb said quietly. Dylan swallowed. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flickered faintly outside the warehouse. Sheriff Tom Harlan's truck pulled up, gravel crunching sharply. The sheriff stepped out, hand near his holster but not drawn. What in God's name is going on? He demanded. Dylan raised his hands immediately. Misfire, he said quickly. Accidental discharge. Sheriff Harlan's eyes shifted to Caleb, then to Shadow. The blood on the dog's fur changed everything. Caleb met the sheriff's gaze steadily. He pulled a weapon, Caleb said calmly. My dog stepped in. Shadow attempted to rise but faltered slightly. Caleb steadied him. Sheriff Harlan turned to the contractor. Set it down, he ordered firmly. The contractor complied. The warehouse fell into tense silence. Snowlight filtered through broken boards overhead. Shadow's breathing steadied slightly under Caleb's hand. The bullet had grazed, not penetrated deeply. Still, blood stained the floor. Dylan looked shaken now, not polished, not composed. You need to get him to a vet, Sheriff Harlan said to Caleb. Caleb nodded. He lifted Shadow carefully into his arms. The dog remained conscious, eyes fixed on Caleb. You did good, Caleb whispered. As he carried Shadow toward the exit, Dylan stepped aside. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his posture. Only fear, not of Caleb, of exposure. Outside, the mountain air felt brutally clear. Caleb placed Shadow gently in the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. The sheriff's voice carried behind him. We'll talk about this, Harlan said sharply to Dylan. Caleb didn't look back. He started the engine. As he drove toward the rural veterinary clinic near Ironwood Lake, his chest tightened, not from PTSD this time. From something deeper. Rage. Not wild. Controlled. Someone had pointed a weapon at him, and Shadow had stepped forward without hesitation. The emotional shift detonated fully now. This wasn't leverage anymore. This was war drawn into the open, and someone had just paid the first price. The road to Ironwood Lake blurred beneath Caleb's tires. Snow along the shoulders had begun to melt under the pale afternoon sun, turning to slush that hissed under the truck's wheels. The world outside looked almost peaceful, blue sky pushing through thinning clouds, mountains gleaming clean and white. Inside the cab, Shadow lay across the passenger seat, breathing steady but shallow. Blood had soaked into the fur along his shoulder, dark and wet against the tan coat. Caleb kept one hand pressed gently but firmly against the wound. "You're good," he whispered. "You're strong." Shadow's eyes never left him. The veterinary clinic sat near the lake's edge, a low wooden building with a green roof and a faded sign that read Ironwood Veterinary Services. Pine trees framed the parking lot, their shadows stretching long across the snow. Caleb pulled in hard and cut the engine. He moved quickly but carefully, lifting Shadow into his arms. The clinic door chimed softly as he stepped inside. Dr. Elaine Porter looked up from behind the counter, her expression shifting instantly when she saw the blood. "Back room," she said without hesitation. Caleb laid Shadow on the examination table. The fluorescent lights hummed above. Dr. Porter examined the wound with calm efficiency. "Grazed," she said after a moment. "Clean line. It didn't lodge." Caleb exhaled for the first time since the warehouse. "Will he lose mobility?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied. "He's lucky." Caleb nodded once. Lucky. Shadow's ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. Dr. Porter began cleaning the wound, speaking gently to the dog. Shadow endured it without complaint, muscles tense but controlled. "He's trained," she observed. "SEAL K9, Caleb replied. She glanced up at him briefly. "That explains the discipline." The cleaning process was careful, methodical. Sutures were placed where necessary. The wound dressed properly. Throughout it all, Shadow's gaze remained fixed on Caleb, not panicked, not confused, present. When the procedure was finished, Dr. Porter wrapped the shoulder securely and stepped back. "He'll need rest," she said. "No heavy movement for a few days. Keep him warm." Caleb ran his hand slowly along Shadow's neck. "Thank you," he said. The sun dipped lower as Caleb carried Shadow outside again. Instead of returning immediately to the mountain estate, he drove a short distance down the lakeside road and parked near an old wooden dock. The lake lay still beneath fading light, thin ice forming along the edges. The mountains reflected softly across its surface. Caleb turned off the engine. Silence filled the truck. This time, it wasn't tense. It was heavy. He climbed out and opened the passenger door gently. Shadow stepped down carefully, testing his weight. He limped slightly, but held steady. Caleb guided him toward the dock. They sat together on the weathered planks, Caleb's boots hanging just above the icy water. The sky turned amber, then deepened toward blue. For a long while, neither moved. Caleb stared out over the lake. His mind drifted not to the warehouse, not to Dylan, but farther back. Another lake, another dock. Years ago, he remembered Maggie standing beside him when he was barely 18, telling him that the mountains didn't judge. "They just reflect," she had said. He swallowed. Shadow shifted closer, resting his head lightly against Caleb's thigh. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder from the bunker. He hadn't listened to it yet. He pressed play. Maggie's voice crackled softly through the tiny speaker. "Caleb," she began, quieter than in the video files. "If this reaches you, then you've seen enough to know this was never about inheritance." The lake remained still. "I knew they would try to erase you," she continued. "Not because you were weak, but because you are not easily controlled." Caleb's chest tightened. "Dylan thinks stability means silence. I think it means standing firm." The wind brushed lightly across the dock. "I asked questions he didn't want answered. I traced patterns he hoped no one would see." Her voice wavered slightly. "But I also knew something else." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "I knew you would need a partner who understood silence and survival." He glanced down at Shadow. "In case you never asked," Maggie continued. "Yes, I requested him. I funded the veteran placement program quietly. I saw your service file. I saw the signs of what the desert had done to you." Caleb's breath caught. "I knew you would pretend you were fine. I also knew Shadow would not let you disappear into that pretense." The recording crackled softly. "You were never unstable, Caleb. You were wounded, and wounded men deserve protection, not dismissal." Caleb felt something shift deep in his chest. Not rage, not sorrow, release. The sun slipped below the ridgeline. The lake darkened. "And if usitation this," Maggie's voice finished gently, "then you are standing where you were meant to stand." The recording ended. Silence returned. Caleb sat still for a long time. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing his weight against Caleb's leg. "You were planned," Caleb whispered. Shadow's tail thumped once. The knowledge settled slowly. Shadow hadn't been coincidence. He hadn't been random placement. Maggie had orchestrated it. Years ago, she had seen what Caleb hadn't allowed himself to see, that the mission didn't end overseas. It just changed. The emotional storm inside him softened. The explosion at the warehouse had burned hot and sharp. Now came the quiet after. The weight of what could have been lost. Caleb placed both hands on Shadow's face gently. "You don't get to leave," he said softly. Shadow blinked slowly. The first stars appeared overhead. Across the lake, cabin lights flickered on. Somewhere in town, Dylan was recalculating. Somewhere in the sheriff's office, reports were being filed. And somewhere in a hidden bunker beneath stone walls, years of truth waited to surface. Caleb stood slowly and helped Shadow back toward the truck. The night air felt cleaner now, sharper. The anger hadn't disappeared. It had cooled, refined. He looked once more across the lake. "They thought they could scare us," he said quietly. Shadow stepped forward, steady despite the bandage. Caleb opened the passenger door carefully. As Shadow climbed in, Caleb felt the final emotional shift of the day. From explosion to silence. And within that silence, something new was forming. Not just evidence, not just leverage. A reckoning. The lake behind them faded into darkness as Caleb drove back toward town. Headlights cut a clean path through the winding road, illuminating snowbanks and the occasional deer standing motionless in the trees. Inside the truck, Shadow lay quietly, bandaged shoulder rising and falling in steady rhythm. Caleb didn't turn on the radio. He needed the quiet. The recording from Maggie echoed in his mind. "I requested him. I funded the placement. You were never unstable. You were wounded." Those words settled deeper than any accusation Dylan had thrown in that courtroom. By the time Caleb reached the small cabin he had rented on the outskirts of town, night had fully settled over Pine Ridge. The porch light flickered on as he stepped out of the truck. He carried Shadow inside carefully and laid him on a thick blanket near the wood stove. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee grounds. Caleb lit the stove slowly, feeding it split logs until warmth began to push back against the cold. Shadow shifted but did not rise. "You're staying put," Caleb said gently. Shadow's eyes remained fixed on him. Caleb pulled the laptop from his pack and set it on the small wooden table. He connected the second hard drive and opened the remaining video files from Maggie. He needed to understand everything. The first video loaded. Maggie sat at the same desk, but this time, her tone was softer. "Caleb," she began, "there's something I never told you." Caleb leaned closer to the screen. "When I first learned about the veteran placement program pairing retired SEAL dogs with returning operators, I requested access to the review board. I asked to see files not for charity, but for compatibility." The fire crackled behind him. "I saw your name. I saw the commendations. And I saw the medical notes." Caleb swallowed. "You were highly decorated," Maggie continued, "but they marked concerns about your reintegration. Hypervigilance, insomnia, emotional withdrawal." Shadow's ears twitched faintly at the sound of her voice through the speakers. "I knew what that meant," Maggie said softly. "I had seen it before in other soldiers." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "You would never ask for help," Maggie continued. "So I made sure help found you." The video cut to footage from what appeared to be a training facility, rows of canine kennels, handlers walking alongside highly trained dogs. "That dog you call Shadow," Maggie said, her voice overlaying the footage, "had lost his previous handler in an operation overseas. He had become withdrawn, unresponsive to reassignment." Caleb's breath slowed. "They labeled him difficult," Maggie continued. "I saw something else. I saw grief." The footage shifted to Shadow standing alone in a kennel, eyes alert but distant. "You were two wounded souls," Maggie said, "and wounded souls sometimes recognize each other." The screen returned to Maggie's face. "I requested that Shadow be considered for your final deployment." Officially, it was framed as an operational pairing. Unofficially, it was protection. I was, Caleb looked down at the dog lying by the stove. "You needed someone who would pull you back from the edge without judging you," Maggie said. "Shadow needed someone who would not abandon him." The recording paused automatically. Caleb stared at the frozen frame. The cabin felt smaller, warmer, different. He remembered that final deployment. He remembered the moment Shadow had refused to leave his side after the blast that ended Caleb's career. The memory surfaced clearly now. Dust in the air, ears ringing, disorientation, Shadow pressing against him, refusing to move even when medics shouted. He had thought it was training. It had been loyalty. He rose slowly and walked to Shadow. "You were never random," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head weakly, eyes soft but steady. Caleb knelt beside him. "They thought we were broken," he said quietly. Shadow's tail thumped once against the blanket. Caleb ran his hand gently along the dog's neck. They were wrong. The emotional shift deepened. The anger that had flared in the warehouse was no longer sharp. It was purposeful. Maggie hadn't just left him evidence. She had built a safety net around him long before Dylan tried to erase him in court. Caleb returned to the laptop and opened another file. This one wasn't video. It was a scanned document titled Veteran K-9 Integration Initiative Private Sponsorship Agreement. Maggie's signature appeared at the bottom. She had funded not only Shadow's placement but ongoing care support for several other veterans and service dogs in the region. Caleb leaned back in his chair. She had been fighting quietly on two fronts: against corrupt land deals, and for soldiers who came home carrying invisible scars. A knock sounded at the cabin door. Caleb's posture shifted instantly. Shadow attempted to rise, but Caleb placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I've got it," he said softly. He moved to the door and opened it slightly. Olivia stood outside, coat pulled tight against the cold night air. "I heard about the warehouse," she said quietly. "Sheriff Harlan called me." Caleb nodded. "He's okay," Olivia said, glancing toward Shadow inside. "Grazed," Caleb replied. Olivia stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The warmth from the stove wrapped around them. She noticed the laptop screen. "You've been reviewing everything," she said. Caleb nodded. "She was building a federal case," he replied. "Draft ready." Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "That changes things," she said. "It also makes us targets," Caleb added. Olivia hesitated. "You're thinking about going public?" "I'm thinking about finishing what she started," Caleb said calmly. Shadow shifted on the blanket, adjusting his position. Olivia looked at the dog thoughtfully. "She always believed in you," she said. Caleb glanced at her. "She believed in him too," he replied. Outside, the wind picked up again briefly, brushing against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned steadily. The emotional silence from the lake had evolved into revelation. Not explosive. Transformative. Caleb understood now that this wasn't just a land dispute. It was exposure versus concealment. Truth versus control. And Shadow, wounded but unbroken, was the living proof of what Maggie had invested in. Caleb closed the laptop slowly. "We're not hiding," he said. Olivia nodded once. "Then we prepare carefully," she replied. Caleb looked down at Shadow. "You and me," he whispered. "All the way." Shadow's eyes closed briefly, trusting. The reckoning Maggie had prepared was no longer abstract. It was personal. And for the first time since the courtroom, Caleb didn't feel erased. He felt chosen. Morning came cold and sharp over Pine Ridge. The courthouse steps were dusted with fresh snow, sunlight glinting off ice along the railings. The same building that had stripped Caleb of his inheritance now stood crowded with people. Word had spread quickly. Dylan Hale had filed a formal complaint accusing Caleb of unlawful entry, theft of private corporate materials, and reckless conduct during the warehouse incident. It was meant to flip the narrative, to make Caleb the unstable aggressor. Instead, it had drawn attention. Caleb stood outside the courthouse entrance, coat zipped high against the wind. Shadow sat beside him, shoulder bandaged neatly but posture straight and disciplined. People noticed the bandage. Whispers traveled. "That's the SEAL's dog. He took a hit for him. Heard it was an accident. Or maybe not." Sheriff Tom Harlan stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with two deputies. His expression was firm but not hostile. Olivia Brooks approached Caleb, legal folder tucked beneath her arm. "They're pushing for an emergency review," she said, "trying to freeze your access to the estate pending investigation." Caleb nodded calmly. And we're countering," she replied. "We're presenting the evidence your aunt gathered." Caleb glanced at the courthouse doors. "This town deserves to know," he said. Shadow leaned slightly against his leg. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than before, but fuller. Ranchers in worn denim jackets, retired miners, local shop owners, a few veterans Caleb recognized but had never spoken to. Dylan sat at the opposite table, flanked by a polished attorney from Denver. The contractor from the warehouse was absent. The judge entered. "All rise." Everyone stood. Caleb felt the familiar hum of adrenaline beneath his skin, but it was controlled, focused. The judge settled into her seat. This hearing concerns the complaint filed by Mr. Dylan Hale against Mr. Caleb Mercer, she began. Allegations of unlawful possession of corporate materials and escalation of conflict. Dylan's attorney stood first. Your Honor, he began smoothly. Mr. Mercer unlawfully entered a structure scheduled for review and removed confidential business materials belonging to Hale Mountain Development. Caleb remained still. Furthermore, the attorney continued, he provoked an altercation that resulted in the discharge of a firearm. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound, but he did not move. Olivia rose slowly. Your Honor, she said clearly. We dispute both claims. She approached the bench and handed over a packet. Mr. Mercer holds a legally recorded deed to the estate in question, she said. Filed 2 years prior under Agricultural Trust Code. The judge reviewed the document briefly. And the materials? The judge asked. Olivia placed a second binder on the bench. Collected by Margaret Hale over the past decade, she said, documenting irregular land acquisitions, pressure tactics, and possible fraudulent practices tied to Hale Mountain Development. The courtroom shifted. Dylan's posture stiffened. These are allegations, his attorney interjected sharply. Olivia nodded, which is why we are submitting video recordings, financial documents, and signed affidavits gathered by Miss Hale. She turned toward the gallery. She intended to submit these materials to state and federal authorities. The room grew quieter. The judge leaned forward slightly. Do you have proof of these claims? Olivia nodded toward Caleb. Caleb stood slowly. He walked to the evidence table and connected a hard drive to the courtroom's display monitor. The screen flickered to life. The first video played Maggie, seated at her desk, calm and deliberate. If you are seeing this, she said, then I have failed to protect this valley quietly. Gasps moved through the room. The video cut to meetings between Dylan and investors, footage of land negotiations, redlined contracts. The judge's expression hardened. Dylan's attorney rose quickly. These recordings were obtained without consent. They were recorded on private property, Olivia interrupted calmly, by the property owner. The judge raised a hand for silence. Continue, she said. Caleb stepped back. The video shifted to a rancher explaining how he had been pressured into signing an agreement under threat of tax penalties. Another clip showed internal emails referencing fast-track consolidation before opposition mobilizes. The emotional tide in the room turned visibly. Ranchers exchanged glances. One older man removed his hat slowly. Dylan's polished composure began to crack. This is selective presentation, his attorney insisted. Then explain it, Olivia replied. The judge turned toward Dylan. Mr. Hale, she said, are you aware of these documents? Dylan stood. I am aware of business strategies, he said tightly. Nothing illegal. Sheriff Harlan rose from the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, he said, the firearm discharge at the warehouse has been reviewed. It was not initiated by Mr. Mercer. The room fell silent. Shadow shifted slightly at Caleb's side. Furthermore, the sheriff continued, Mr. Mercer's dog prevented further escalation. Eyes turned toward Shadow. The bandage on his shoulder was impossible to ignore. Caleb remained steady. He did not speak. He did not posture. He simply stood beside the dog who had taken the first hit. The judge closed the binder slowly. This matter exceeds the scope of a local civil complaint, she said firmly. Given the materials presented, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office and recommending immediate review at the state level. A murmur rolled through the courtroom, like distant thunder. Dylan's attorney leaned toward him urgently, whispering. The judge continued, pending investigation. No development actions tied to the disputed parcels may proceed. Dylan's jaw clenched. This is outrageous, he muttered. The judge's gaze sharpened. What is outrageous, she replied, is the possibility that this court was misled. The gavel struck once. Hearing adjourned. People rose slowly. But this time, no one avoided Caleb's eyes. A rancher approached him quietly. You got more of that footage? He asked. Caleb nodded once. Good, the man said, because some of us were pressured too. Another veteran stepped forward. Need backup? He asked quietly. Caleb looked at Shadow, then back at the man. Not alone anymore, he said. Outside, the snow had melted slightly under midday sun. Dylan exited the courthouse, flanked by his attorney, face tight and pale. He did not look at Caleb. Not this time. Olivia stepped beside Caleb on the steps. That shifted everything, she said softly. Caleb exhaled slowly. Not finished, he replied. No, Olivia agreed, but no longer hidden. Shadow sat calmly at his side, eyes scanning the square. The emotional reversal was complete. From silence to rising tension, the town had seen. The mountain's secret was no longer buried, and the reckoning Maggie prepared had stepped into daylight. The shift did not happen all at once. It moved through Pine Ridge like thawing ice, slow, quiet, unstoppable. Within 48 hours of the hearing, 2 state investigators arrived in unmarked sedans. They met with Sheriff Harlan first, then with Olivia in her small brick office above the pharmacy. Boxes of Maggie's archived documents were transferred carefully, catalogued, signed for. Caleb stood back during most of it. He had done his part. Now, the machinery of law had begun to turn. Shadow remained at his side through every meeting, shoulder healing well but still wrapped. People noticed that too, the scar forming beneath the bandage, a visible reminder of the line that had been crossed. 3 days after the hearing, Hale Mountain Development's main office in town closed early. By the end of the week, a formal notice was posted on the courthouse bulletin board. Pending investigation. All development activities suspended. The town square felt different. Conversations were no longer whispered. They were direct. At the diner on Main Street, Caleb sat alone at the counter one morning when the owner, Mrs. Landry, slid a plate of eggs toward him without charging. "For the dog," she said quietly. "And for standing up." Caleb nodded once. Shadow lay at his feet, alert but relaxed. Across town, Dylan Hale was no longer seen in polished suits. He arrived at the sheriff's office twice for questioning. Reporters from Denver began circling quietly after word reached larger outlets. The emotional tension that had filled the courthouse now began to transform. It wasn't triumph. It was accountability. Caleb didn't attend the state review sessions. He returned instead to the mountain estate. The mansion no longer felt abandoned. It felt transitional. Snow had begun melting from the roof, icicles dripping steadily from gutters. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating dust that no longer seemed lifeless. Caleb walked through the foyer slowly, Shadow pacing beside him more comfortably now. The steel hatch remained hidden beneath the floorboard, but it no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a foundation. Olivia joined him at the estate that afternoon, climbing the stone steps with a folder tucked under her arm. "They froze Dylan's personal accounts," she said once inside. "Investors are distancing themselves." Caleb nodded. "And the land?" he asked. "Parcel reviews are underway," she replied. "Some owners are filing formal complaints. Your aunt's documentation gave them leverage." A, 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 A. Caleb walked to the large front window overlooking the valley. The view stretched wide pine forest, distant ridgelines, Ironwood Lake shimmering in the distance. "This place sits at the center of it all," Olivia said quietly behind him. Caleb turned. "Maggie didn't protect it just to block development," Olivia continued. "She preserved it for something." Caleb looked down at Shadow. The dog moved carefully now, but with growing strength. "You've been sleeping in a truck," Olivia added gently. "That estate is yours." Caleb considered that. The house was large, too large for one man and a dog, too isolated to remain empty. He walked slowly through the grand hall, past covered furniture and old photographs. He paused again at the image of Maggie standing beside uniformed soldiers and a service dog. "You know what she funded?" he asked. Olivia nodded slightly. "The Veteran Placement Initiative," she said. "And more," Caleb replied. "She drafted plans." He walked toward the staircase and knelt near the floorboard. He lifted it carefully and descended into the bunker once more. Olivia followed this time. The reinforced hallway felt less ominous now, more purposeful. Caleb opened a drawer he had not examined thoroughly before. Inside were architectural sketches, not for cabins, for adaptive living quarters, therapy rooms, outdoor training trails, community spaces. Rocky Ridge Veteran Sanctuary. The name was written in Maggie's hand across the top of the first page. Olivia inhaled softly. "She planned this," she said. Caleb nodded. "She knew she might not win the land fight," he replied. "So she prepared something better." He walked back upstairs slowly. The sunlight, through the tall windows, felt warmer now. In town, the news finally broke publicly. A regional outlet reported that Hale Mountain Development was under state and possible federal investigation for fraudulent acquisition practices. Dylan issued a brief statement denying wrongdoing, but the denial felt hollow. Sheriff Harlan stopped by the estate one evening just before sunset. He removed his hat respectfully as he stepped inside. "State investigators executed warrants this morning," he said quietly. "They found what they were looking for." Caleb nodded once. "And Dylan?" he asked. "Cooperating," the sheriff replied carefully. "Doesn't have much choice." Shadow sat upright near the doorway, eyes alert. Harlan glanced at the dog. "He's healing well," he said. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied. The sheriff shifted his weight. "You planning to stay up here?" he asked. Caleb looked out over the valley again. Snow patches were shrinking daily. Pine branches shed their weight. A faint trail behind the estate had begun to reappear under melting ice. "I am," Caleb said. Harlan studied him. "Town could use something steady," he said. Caleb met his gaze. "That's the plan." The sheriff nodded once and left. As twilight settled over the mountains, Caleb stood on the porch with Shadow beside him. The air was crisp, but no longer biting. Below, Ironwood Lake reflected the last streaks of orange sky. The emotional arc had shifted again, from rising tension to justice taking shape, not loud, not celebratory, measured. Maggie's documentation had cracked open something larger than family rivalry. It had exposed systemic manipulation, and it had given the town a choice. Caleb rested his hand gently on Shadow's back. "They tried to bury it," he said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once, but she built it strong. Lights flickered on in distant cabins across the valley. Smoke rose straight into calm air. The collapse of Dylan's control was not dramatic in one explosive moment. It was structural. Foundations shifting. Supports removed. The mountain remained steady. And for the first time since the courtroom, Caleb understood something clearly. He hadn't inherited just land. He had inherited purpose. And purpose, unlike profit, could not be seized. It had to be lived. Spring came slowly to the foothills. Snow retreated in uneven patches across the estate, revealing damp earth and stubborn blades of grass pushing upward through thawed soil. The pine trees shed their winter heaviness, branches stretching free under longer daylight. The mansion no longer stood silent. Hammers echoed through its halls. Voices carried across the valley. Caleb stood on the wraparound porch one early morning, coffee steaming in his hand, watching a small crew of volunteers unload lumber from a flatbed truck. Ranchers, retired miners, two veterans who had shown up after the courthouse hearing. No one had asked for payment. They had asked how they could help. Shadow moved carefully down the porch steps, his shoulder fully healed now, scar faint beneath the coat. He walked with the quiet confidence of a dog who had endured and returned. Below the porch, a wooden sign leaned against a stack of stones. Rocky Ridge Veteran Sanctuary. Caleb picked it up and ran his thumb across the carved letters. Maggie's handwriting had been translated into wood. Inside the mansion, dust sheets were gone. Large windows had been cleaned, letting sunlight flood the grand hall. The bunker beneath the floor had been reorganized not as a secret vault anymore, but as secure archive storage for legal proceedings that were still ongoing at the state level. Dylan Hale was no longer in Pine Ridge. Investigations had widened beyond county lines. Some investors had distanced themselves publicly. Others faced scrutiny of their own. But Caleb no longer followed the headlines. His focus had shifted. In the rear field behind the mansion, a trail was being cleared wide enough for guided walks, lined with low wooden fences. Plans for adaptive housing units were pinned to a temporary board inside what had once been a formal dining room. Olivia stood beside him that afternoon, reviewing permits. "You're serious about this?" she said. "I am," Caleb replied. She glanced at the open valley below. "You could have sold it," she added. "Made a clean break." Caleb watched as Shadow trotted toward a young German Shepherd pup being introduced by a local trainer. The older dog approached slowly, calm, and deliberate, offering quiet reassurance. "I wasn't given this to leave," Caleb said. Weeks passed. The sanctuary opened quietly. No ribbon cutting, no press conference. Just a small gathering of locals on a warm afternoon. 3 veterans arrived that first month. One with insomnia so severe he hadn't slept through a night in years. One who avoided crowds entirely. One who had lost a service dog and hadn't spoken much since. Caleb met each of them at the front steps. No speeches, no ceremony, just a handshake and a steady look. Shadow remained close, observing. In the evenings, Caleb would walk the forest trail with them, boots crunching softly over pine needles. He spoke little at first. He understood that silence could be more comforting than words. The estate slowly transformed. Therapy rooms replaced unused parlors. Community dinners filled the long dining table. The once abandoned halls carried laughter, cautious at first, then stronger. One evening near the end of summer, Caleb stood again on the wooden bridge that crossed the small creek at the edge of the property. The water ran clear beneath him now, reflecting gold light from the setting sun. Shadow stood beside him, tail swaying slowly. Below, two veterans worked with their new service dogs, under the guidance of a trainer, practicing basic commands. Sit. Stay. Easy. The mountain air was warm, clean, alive. Caleb leaned against the railing. For a moment, the memory of the courtroom returned. The humiliation, the erasure, the suggestion of instability. He exhaled slowly. It felt distant now, not forgotten, transformed. Shadow nudged his hand. Caleb smiled faintly. You were right, he murmured. The dog's ears flicked. You always are. Down the slope, headlights approached along the gravel road. A small pickup truck rolled to a stop near the gate. Sheriff Harlan stepped out, hat in hand. Caleb walked down to meet him. Evening, Harlan said. Evening, Caleb replied. The sheriff looked around at the estate. State charges filed this morning, he said quietly. Formal. Caleb nodded. Good, he said. Harlan studied him. You don't seem surprised. I'm not, Caleb replied. The sheriff's gaze shifted toward the veterans training below. You turned this around fast, he said. Caleb followed his gaze. Didn't do it alone, he said. Harlan nodded once, then placed his hat back on. Town's proud, he added. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked up toward the mansion, sunlight catching the stone walls, then down at Shadow, standing strong and steady. He remembered Maggie's words. Standing firm, protection, not erasure. Harlan tipped his hat and returned to his truck. The sun dipped lower. The mountains turned deep purple at their edges. Lantern lights flickered on along the porch. Caleb walked back across the bridge slowly, Shadow pacing beside him. From the main hall came the sound of quiet conversation and the clatter of dishes being set for dinner. He paused at the steps and looked out one final time over the valley. This had begun in humiliation, in silence, in doubt, but it had grown into something larger than vindication. It had become shelter. He knelt briefly, resting his forehead against Shadow's. They tried to bury what mattered, he said softly. Shadow's tail moved once. Caleb stood. Behind him, voices called his name not with accusation, not with dismissal, but with belonging. He stepped inside. The doors remained open, and on the porch, beneath the carved wooden sign, a light glowed steadily against the coming night. Not a warning, a welcome. If you believe a man should never be erased for standing his ground, type yes in the comments. And if you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours, drop a 1 so we know you're still standing strong. If stories about justice, dignity, and protecting your land mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe. We've got more mountain truths coming your way.